The Mafia boss had controlled the city for nearly 4 decades. Ruthless, untouchable, absolute. But there was one weakness no one dared whisper about. He was born deaf. No warning shots heard before ambushes, no trembling voices of traitors, no final confessions from the men he eliminated. Silence was the fortress he lived in, the cage he couldn't escape. That Tuesday morning, he sat rigid in his private study while his new maid worked the room. She moved with purpose, professional, nearly invisible, exactly how he demanded it. Until she stopped cold. Her gaze fixed on the side of his head with an intensity that made his jaw clench. She took one step closer, then another, her dark hands trembling as they rose toward him. Then she did something no one had dared in 37 years. She touched him without permission. With surgeon-like precision, she reached toward his ear and extracted something impossibly small, something buried, something every high-priced specialist had somehow missed. Liam Parker's body went rigid. Pressure released inside his skull like a dam breaking. And then, for the first time in his entire life, he heard it. The ragged gasp of his own breath. The grandfather clock is ticking in the corner. The world is rushing in like a tidal wave. The silence he'd ruled from shattered in an instant. At that moment, the most dangerous man in the city realized the greatest revelation of his life had come from a woman in a maid's uniform, someone he'd barely noticed until she changed everything. Stay with me until the end, because what he discovers next will expose a conspiracy that reaches into the heart of his empire. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Liam Parker owned everything that mattered. The harbor where cargo containers disappeared from manifests before customs ever saw them. The construction sites where money got laundered through concrete and steel. The casino floors where politicians lost on purpose and paid their debts in favors. Men with twice his muscle went pale when his charcoal suit appeared in their doorway. District attorneys returned his calls before dawn. Judges revised their rulings with a single look from his steel-gray eyes. For 37 years, he had built a criminal empire on fear, control, and calculated silence. But Liam's silence ran deeper than strategy. While his enemies assumed his quietness was pure intimidation, the stillness of a predator before it strikes, the truth was far more devastating. Liam Parker had never heard a single syllable of the threats he issued, never caught the crack in a liar's voice, never experienced the satisfaction of hearing his victims beg. He existed in a world without sound, ruling through lip reading so precise it bordered on telepathy, through vibrations he felt through marble floors, through the language of fear written across faces in ways most people never learned to read. The Parker estate rose like a monument on the hill overlooking the harbor. 32 rooms of Italian marble, stolen Renaissance paintings, and chandeliers worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Security cameras tracked every shadow. Armed men in expensive suits patrolled corridors that whispered of old money and new violence. And somewhere deep inside those walls, Liam lived in absolute quiet, commanding his underworld through observation, intelligence, and the kind of ruthlessness that made grown men confess before he even asked questions. His study occupied the mansion's top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that bent to his will. The mahogany desk had witnessed handshakes that moved millions and signatures that ended lives. Behind that desk sat Liam, always in perfectly tailored charcoal gray, always watching with those calculating eyes, always 3 moves ahead of everyone who thought they could challenge him. The household staff understood the rules without being told. No sudden movements near him. No attempting conversation. No direct eye contact unless he initiated it. Liam preferred his environment controlled, predictable, sterile. Chaos belonged in the streets he managed, not within the sanctuary of his silence. That Tuesday started like every other. Financial reports from the docks. Revenue projections from the casino operations. Asset transfers routed through shell companies in the Caymans. The numbers told their familiar story of power and profit, Everything moved according to his design, every variable accounted for, every potential threat neutralized before it could materialize. Then Bobby Baker walked into his study for the first time, and everything Liam thought he understood about his life began to unravel. She arrived precisely at 7:30 for her first day, not early, not late, exactly on time. She carried herself differently than the previous staff. Where others moved with nervous energy, checking over their shoulders, she walked with quiet confidence. Her background check had been flawless. Previous employers praised her discretion, her efficiency, her ability to work for hours without supervision or acknowledgement. More importantly, she came from the old neighborhood, where people understood that survival meant keeping your mouth shut and your eyes down. Mrs. Chin, the head housekeeper, had led her through the mansion's corridors with precise instructions: start in the guest quarters. Move through the formal dining rooms. Save the master's study for last, and only enter when he signals permission. Never interrupt. Never ask questions. Never assume you understand anything about this house or the man who runs it. Bobby had nodded at each rule, absorbing them with the kind of focus that suggested she understood exactly what kind of house she was working in. She'd been in service to wealthy families before: old money, new money, dangerous money. But nothing quite prepared her for the Parker estate, where even the walls seemed to hold their breath, where silence wasn't peaceful but oppressive, as if the mansion itself was afraid to make noise. Liam noticed her immediately when she entered his study that afternoon. Not because she was striking, though she moved with an elegance that commanded respect. Not because she seemed nervous, though he detected the slight tension in her shoulders as she began working. He noticed her because she moved with purpose. Each gesture is deliberate. Each movement is efficient. She respected the space she occupied in a way that suggested genuine professionalism rather than performative fear. She worked methodically around the room. The bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes he never read but kept for appearances. The crystal decanters contained scotch older than most of his street soldiers. The ivory chess set was arranged on a board where no game had been played in 15 years, just another prop in the performance of power. Liam watched her from his peripheral vision, cataloging every movement, while appearing focused on his financial reports. She handled each object with appropriate care, efficient but never rushed. She understood the unspoken rule: in this house, you were furniture until the moment you became a problem. Then something shifted. Her movement slowed as she approached the window near his desk. She paused mid-motion, dusting cloth suspended in her hand. Liam's eyes lifted from his paperwork to find her staring directly at him, not at his face, but at the right side of his head, with an expression that made his chest tighten with unfamiliar tension. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a curiosity. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition. Or worse, compassion. She took one step closer. Then another. Her gaze remained locked on his ear with an intensity that made every instinct scream danger. No one stared at Liam Parker like this. No one examined him as if he were a puzzle requiring a solution. His hand moved instinctively toward the desk drawer where he kept his Glock. But Bobby Baker's expression wasn't threatening. It was concerning. Almost maternal. She raised her hand slowly, her finger trembling as she pointed toward his ear. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear but somehow felt vibrating in the space between them. The air itself seemed charged with whatever message she was trying to convey. Liam's entire world operated on control. Every variable is managed. Every outcome was predicted. Every threat eliminated before it could materialize. But this moment existed outside his carefully constructed reality. This woman, this stranger in an orange uniform with white trim, was seeing something that dozens of specialists had missed throughout his entire life. And in the seconds before she reached toward him, before everything changed, Liam Parker felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: vulnerability. Her hand hovered inches from his ear. He could feel the warmth radiating from her palm, and could sense the careful deliberation in her movement. Every survival instinct demanded he pull away, reassert dominance, remind this woman exactly who she was dealing with. But something deeper held him frozen, something he had spent 37 years burying. Trust. What happened next would shatter more than just his silence. It would crack open a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the one disability everyone assumed was permanent. Bobby Baker's fingers moved toward his ear with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. And when she found it, when she gently extracted that small, dark mass that had been lodged there since childhood, Liam Parker's entire understanding of his life, and the people he trusted with it, would collapse in a single, devastating rush of sound. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into story. Liam Parker understood power in ways most men never would. While others relied on raised voices and shouted threats, he had learned to read the microscopic tremors that betrayed a lie, the flutter of an eyelid, the twitch at the corner of a mouth, the way a man's throat convulsed when he swallowed fear. Silence had forced him to become a master of observation, turning his disability into the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. Every morning at precisely 6 a.m., he watched the city wake from his study windows. The harbor came alive first, cargo ships sliding into port, crane operators beginning their shifts, his men moving between containers with manifest sheets that never quite matched what customs would see. He couldn't hear the machinery, the shouts between dock workers, the grinding of metal on metal. But he felt it. The vibrations traveled through the mansion's foundation, through the floor, up through his Italian leather shoes. Each pattern told a story. Smooth, rhythmic tremors meant operations running on schedule. Irregular pulses meant problems that required his attention. His lieutenant Marco arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, as he had for 20 years. Liam watched him approach across the marble floor, reading every detail. The confident stride meant collections had gone well. The slight hesitation before sitting meant someone had caused trouble. Marco's lips moved in their familiar patterns, and Liam absorbed every word without hearing a sound. The Rossetti crew had been late on their protection payments. The construction permits had been expedited as planned. The judge in the waterfront development case had seen reason after their conversation. But it was what Marco didn't say that interested Liam most. The way his eyes shifted left when discussing the Rossetti situation. The extra breath he took before mentioning the judge. The microscopic tightening of his jaw when he finished his report. Most people thought they could lie to a deaf man, that without hearing the stress in their voice, deception would go unnoticed. They were catastrophically wrong. Liam had spent 37 years learning to see sound. When someone's heart rate spiked with anxiety, he saw it in the pulse at their neck. When their breathing quickened with fear, he watched their chests rise and fall in an accelerating rhythm. When they lied, their entire body betrayed them in 1,000 tiny ways that hearing people never learned to recognize. His disability had made him something more dangerous than any man with functioning ears, a human lie detector who missed nothing. By mid-morning, 3 of his captains had come and gone. Each one thought they were reporting honestly. Each one had secrets they believed were safe. Liam catalogued every micro-expression, every nervous gesture, every tell that revealed the truth beneath their words. Tony Marchetti was skimming from the casino counts. He saw it in the way Tony's fingers drummed against his thigh when discussing revenue, a self-soothing gesture that screamed guilt. Detective Ramirez was considering taking a deal with the state police. The detective's forced casual posture and overly steady eye contact during their meeting were textbook signs of premeditated betrayal. Liam said nothing. Not yet. He simply filed the information away, adding it to the vast mental database of leverage and lies he'd accumulated over decades. When the time came, when it served his purposes, he would act. and each man would wonder how he'd known, never understanding that their bodies had been confessing the entire time. The vibrations beneath his feet shifted slightly as noon approached. New pattern. Heavier footsteps in the corridor below. The cleaning staff began their rounds. Liam felt the subtle tremor of a door closing 3 rooms away, the microscopic shake of floorboards as someone moved through the guest quarters. His world had no sound, but it was far from silent. It pulsed with information that only he knew how to read, a secret language of vibration and visual cues that had kept him alive and in power for 37 years. He had no idea that language was about to become obsolete. Bobby Baker had cleaned for wealthy families before, but the Parker estate felt different the moment she stepped through its service entrance. The other staff moved like they were walking through a minefield, eyes down, voices barely whispers, every gesture measured and deliberate. Mrs. Chin, the head housekeeper, had given her the rules during orientation, but it was the things she didn't say that told the real story. The way she paused before mentioning Mr. Parker's name. The nervous glance toward the upper floors. The careful emphasis on never, ever disturbing him unnecessarily. The guest quarters were immaculate, almost untouched, as if no one had actually slept there in months. Bobby worked through them methodically, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind catalogued details. The sheets were expensive but cold, high thread count, 0 warmth. The artwork on the walls wasn't chosen for beauty but for value, investment pieces, not personal taste. Everything in this house was a statement of power, not comfort. It was a fortress dressed as a mansion. As she moved through the formal dining room, she noticed things the permanent staff had stopped seeing. The chair at the head of the table was positioned differently than the others, angled slightly to provide a clear view of every seat and both doorways. The mirrors were placed strategically throughout the room, creating sight lines that eliminated blind spots. Even the floral arrangements were kept low, never high enough to obstruct anyone's view across the table. This wasn't paranoia. This was the careful architecture of a man who survived by seeing everything. Bobby had worked for a family in Boston once where the father was deaf. She remembered how he'd positioned himself in rooms, how he'd insisted on specific lighting, how he'd watched mouths with an intensity that made visitors uncomfortable. She recognized the same patterns here, but amplified, perfected, weaponized. Mr. Parker hadn't just adapted to his deafness, he'd built an entire empire around compensating for it. The other maids rushed through their tasks, eager to finish and leave. But Bobby found herself slowing down, paying attention to the details they ignored. The way the security cameras were angled to capture faces rather than just bodies. The subtle wear patterns on the marble floors that revealed which paths people took most frequently. The fact that every room had at least 2 exits, and Mr. Parker's office had 3. When Mrs. Chin finally nodded toward the top floor, permission to clean the master's study, Bobby felt the weight of expectation settle over her shoulders. The other staff had been watching her all morning, waiting to see if she'd last or if she'd make some fatal mistake that would get her dismissed before lunch. She'd seen 2 maids come and go in the past month alone, both fired for reasons no one would explain. She climbed the stairs with her cleaning caddy, her orange uniform crisp and professional, her mind already mapping the room she was about to enter. The door was heavy mahogany, slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see him, Mr. Parker, seated at his desk in that perfectly tailored charcoal suit, reviewing papers with the kind of focus that suggested he could calculate your worth and your weaknesses simultaneously. Bobby knocked once, a courtesy she knew he couldn't hear but that felt necessary anyway. When he glanced up and gave a slight nod, she entered his sanctuary of silence. The room was exactly what she expected, windows offering a view of his kingdom, furniture positioned for maximum visual control, nothing out of place. She began with the bookshelves, moving efficiently but not frantically, aware of his peripheral gaze tracking her every movement. Then she saw it. As she moved closer to dust the window ledge near his desk, the afternoon light caught something, a subtle irregularity at the opening of his right ear. Most people wouldn't have noticed. The other staff certainly hadn't. But Bobby had spent 3 years working in her aunt's medical clinic before she turned to domestic work, and she recognized what she was seeing. That wasn't supposed to be there. Bobby's hand froze mid-motion, the dusting cloth suspended above the mahogany surface. From this angle, with the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see it clearly, a dark mass visible just inside Liam Parker's ear canal. Not deep, not hidden. Right there. Obvious to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Her heart kicked against her ribs. 3 years at her aunt's clinic had taught her to recognize impacted cerumen when she saw it. Earwax buildup, severe enough to cause complete blockage. The kind of thing that would take minutes to remove with the right technique. The kind of condition that had no business going untreated for decades. The kind of thing that any competent ENT specialist should have caught during a routine examination. She stood motionless, her mind racing through impossible calculations. Mr. Parker was wealthy enough to afford the best medical care money could buy. Men like him didn't suffer from treatable conditions. They had personal physicians, private specialists, teams of experts at their disposal. Yet there it was, plain as day, a blockage that had probably been there since childhood. Either every doctor who'd examined him was criminally incompetent, or something far more sinister was at play. Bobby glanced at his face. He was still focused on his paperwork, those steel-gray eyes tracking across columns of numbers with predatory precision. She knew he was aware of her presence. Men like Liam Parker were always aware, but he gave no indication that he noticed her stillness, her sudden cessation of movement. She should finish her work. She should leave. She should pretend she'd seen nothing, like everyone else in this house had apparently been doing for years. But the image of that blockage burned in her mind. She thought of her aunt's voice during those long clinic shifts. Sometimes the simplest solution is right in front of us, baby girl. We just have to be brave enough to see it. Bobby had watched her aunt remove dozens of impacted earwax blockages. Had seen patients walk in deaf and walk out hearing. Had witnessed the miracle of something so simple restoring something so profound. Her hands trembled as she set down the dusting cloth. This was insane. She'd been here less than 4 hours. She didn't know this man, didn't understand the rules of his world beyond the basic survival instructions Mrs. Chin had drilled into her. Approaching him uninvited could get her fired. Touching him without permission could get her killed. But that blockage, she couldn't unsee it. Couldn't know what it meant. Bobby took one step closer to his desk. Then another. Her pulse hammered in her throat as Liam's eyes lifted from his paperwork, that cold gaze locking onto her with the intensity of a man who'd built an empire on reading threats. She saw his body language shift, spine straightening, shoulders setting, jaw tightening. Every line of him radiating a silent question, "Why are you in my space?" Her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to raise one trembling hand, pointing toward his right ear. She knew he was deaf. It was the unspoken truth that permeated every rule in this household, but her lips moved anyway, forming words that felt inadequate. "Mr. Parker, your ear. There's something." His expression didn't change, but she saw his hand drift toward the desk drawer. The movement was subtle, practiced, the kind of reflex that suggested he kept something dangerous within easy reach. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply stared at each other, the maid in her orange uniform and the crime lord in his $1,000 suit, separated by 3 feet of charged space and an impossible gulf of power. Then, to her absolute shock, Liam Parker gave the slightest nod. Not permission exactly. More like acknowledgement. Or perhaps curiosity about what this woman who dared approach him could possibly want. Bobby's hands shook harder as she took the final step forward, closing the distance between them. She'd committed now. There was no retreating, no pretending this moment hadn't happened. Her fingers moved toward his ear with the careful precision her aunt had taught her, even as her mind screamed that she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bobby's fingertips made contact with Liam's skin, and she felt him flinch, a microscopic recall that spoke of a man unused to being touched without his explicit permission. His jaw clenched, muscles coiling beneath expensive fabric, but he remained still, watching her, calculating whether this moment would end in miracle or violence. She angled her head to see better, the afternoon light illuminating the ear canal. The blockage was right there, massive and dark, compressed by years of neglect into a solid mass. Her aunt's voice echoed in her memory, gentle pressure, slight rotation, never forcing what won't come freely. She positioned her fingers carefully, finding the edge of the obstruction. Liam's breathing changed. She felt it in the tension of his body, saw it in the rise and fall of his chest. Whatever control he projected to the world, in this moment he was human, vulnerable, and waiting for something he didn't fully understand. Bobby applied gentle pressure, working the blockage with surgeon-like precision. It resisted at first, embedded deep after decades of accumulation. She adjusted her angle, trying again, her entire focus narrowed to this single task. Behind her, the grandfather clock ticked its relentless rhythm. Outside, the city hummed with afternoon traffic. Inside this room, the most powerful man in the criminal underworld sat frozen while a maid in an orange uniform attempted the impossible. Then something shifted. The blockage loosened, releasing its grip on the canal walls. Bobby felt it give way and carefully extracted it, a small, dark mass that had stolen 37 years of sound from a man who'd built an empire in silence. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Liam's entire body went rigid, his hands flying to his head as if struck by an invisible force. His mouth opened but no words came, only a strangled gasp as his brain struggled to process input it had never received. The pressure equalization hit him like a physical blow, air rushing through passages that had been sealed since childhood. Then he heard it. The sound of his own breathing, ragged, desperate, loud in a way he never imagined possible. Each inhale and exhale created waves of sensation that crashed through his consciousness. His chest heaved as panic mixed with wonder, his mind unable to categorize what was happening. The grandfather clock exploded into his awareness next. That steady tick-tock he'd felt as vibrations for decades suddenly had a voice, crisp, mechanical, relentless. Time itself announces its presence with each measured beat. Liam's eyes went wide with shock, his head turning toward the sound source, trying to reconcile the vibration he'd always known with this new dimension of experience. Bobby took a step back, her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound made Liam flinch as if she fired a weapon. Such a simple noise, leather meeting stone, but to his newly awakened ears it rang with the clarity of a church bell. His gaze snapped to her feet, then back to her face, his expression cycling between disbelief and something close to terror. The world beyond his windows revealed itself in layers. Car horns in the distance, their angry voices carrying stories he'd never heard. The low rumble of the harbor's machinery, no longer just vibration but symphony. The whisper of wind against glass. The subtle hum of electrical systems powering his fortress. An entire urban orchestra that had been playing around him for 37 years, and he was finally, impossibly, allowed to hear the music. Liam tried to speak, his vocal cords producing sounds he never experienced from the inside. The vibration in his throat that he'd always relied on now had texture, pitch, presence. His own voice, broken, overwhelmed, human in ways he never allowed himself to be. He looked at Bobby with tears streaming down his face, the most feared man in the city reduced to speechless wonder by a maid who dared to see what everyone else had missed. For 20 minutes, Liam sat motionless in his chair, letting the world wash over him in waves of sound. Every noise felt like a revelation, the rustle of papers on his desk, the distant murmur of staff in other wings of the mansion, the subtle creak of leather as he shifted his weight. Bobby had retreated to the corner of the room, giving him space to process the impossible, her hands still trembling from what she just accomplished. Then his phone rang, and Liam nearly jumped from his seat. The electronic trill cut through the air with jarring clarity, so different from the vibration he'd felt against his palm for decades. He stared at the device for 3 rings before answering, his hand unsteady as he raised it to his ear. Marco's voice hit him like a freight train. Deep, gravelly, textured with cigarettes and whiskey, exactly as Liam had imagined, yet completely foreign. But it wasn't just the timbre that shocked him. It was everything beneath the words. "Boss, we got into a situation at the docks. Nothing serious, but thought you should know." Marco's tone sounded casual, professional even. But Liam heard something else now, a slight elevation in pitch on the word. "Serious." A microscopic hesitation before. "Thought you should know." The almost imperceptible tension in his breathing between sentences. Marco was lying. Or at minimum, downplaying something significant. Liam had relied on visual cues for 37 years. The twitch of an eye, the set of shoulders, the pulse at someone's neck. But vocal stress patterns carried their own language, one he'd never been able to access. The crack in someone's voice when they stretched the truth. The way breath caught in their throat when they concealed information. The subtle shift in cadence that betrayed nervousness no face could hide. "Handle it," Liam managed, his own voice still strange to his ears. He ended the call and sat back, his mind racing through implications that made his chest tighten with cold fury. How many conversations had he misunderstood? How many times had Marco's voice carried warnings that Liam couldn't hear? How many of his men had lied directly to his face, their voices betraying them in ways their expressions never did? His intercom buzzed, another sound that was simultaneously familiar and alien. His head of security checking in for afternoon briefing. Liam listened to the man's report with new attention, and there it was again, vocal patterns that suggested things his face never showed. Forced confidence masking uncertainty. Rehearsed explanations delivered with just slightly too much emphasis. By the time his accountant called with weekly financial updates, Liam had catalogued a dozen instances of vocal deception he would have missed yesterday. The nervous laugh that accompanied a discussion of casino revenues. The too smooth delivery when explaining a discrepancy in construction contracts. The careful modulation that suggested someone reading from prepared lies rather than speaking spontaneous truth. 37 years. 37 years of conversations where people assumed a deaf man couldn't detect the tremor in their voice, the catch in their breath, the subtle shifts in tone that screamed dishonesty. They'd spoken freely in his presence, confident that without hearing, he couldn't catch them. They'd underestimated him in every way except the one that mattered most. Liam's hands curled into fists on his desk, the leather of his chair groaning under the pressure. Another new sound that perfectly matched his rising anger. He'd built his empire on reading faces, on feeling vibrations, on understanding fear through physical cues. But he'd been operating with half the information he needed, and everyone around him had known it. Everyone except him. His gaze shifted to Bobby, still standing quietly near the bookshelf, her expression a mixture of concern and dawning fear as she watched his face harden into something cold and calculating. She'd given him back his hearing, yes. But she'd also revealed something far more devastating, that his most trusted allies had been exploiting his disability for decades, hiding their deceptions behind voices he couldn't hear. The most powerful man in the city had just discovered he'd been ruling a kingdom built on lies. And now he could hear every single one of them. The safe was hidden behind a false panel in the mahogany bookshelf, its existence known only to Liam and the man who'd installed it. He approached it now with new awareness, hearing the soft click of the panel releasing, the mechanical whisper of the combination lock's tumblers falling into place. Even his secrets had sounds he'd never experienced. Inside, among stacks of cash and sensitive documents, sat a filing system that detailed every significant person in his organization. Liam pulled Dr. Morrison's folder with hands that had stopped trembling and started calculating. The folder was thick: 23 years of medical records, consultation notes, payment receipts. 23 years of trust placed in a man who'd supposedly been managing an incurable condition. Liam spread the documents across his desk, his newly awakened ears picking up the rustle of each page, a sound that now felt almost accusatory. The earliest report dated back to when he was 14 years old. His father had brought him to Dr. Morrison after years of failed treatments elsewhere. The diagnosis had been clear, definitive, unchangeable: congenital sensory neural hearing loss. Permanent nerve damage. Nothing to be done except accept and adapt. But Bobby had removed a simple earwax blockage in under a minute. Not nerve damage. Not congenital defect. Just accumulated cerumen that any competent ENT should have noticed during a routine examination. Liam's jaw clenched as he read through subsequent reports, each one reinforcing the same lie. Annual checkups confirming no change in condition. Specialist consultations recommending continued adaptation strategies. Detailed explanations of why surgical intervention would be ineffective and potentially dangerous. Page after page of medical jargon that boiled down to a single message: your deafness is permanent, stop looking for solutions. He found the payment records next, and his blood ran cold. Dr. Morrison's fees were substantial, far more than standard consultations would justify. But it was the pattern that caught his attention. Extra payments made quarterly, always in cash, always documented with vague notations like extended consultation or specialized assessment. Amounts that suggested something beyond medical care. Liam pulled up his financial database on his computer, the keyboard clicks now audible as his fingers moved across the keys. He cross-referenced Dr. Morrison's payments with other transactions from that period. There, a series of cash withdrawals from one of his father's accounts, timing aligned perfectly with the doctor's extra compensation. His father had known, or suspected, or been told. And he'd paid Dr. Morrison handsomely to maintain a diagnosis that kept his son disabled. The question was why? What did his father gain from having a deaf heir? What advantage did Liam's disability provide to the man who'd built this empire before him? The old man had died 5 years ago, taking whatever answers he had to the grave, but the payments to Dr. Morrison had continued. Someone else had picked up where his father left off. Liam methodically went through his financial records, tracking every payment to the doctor since his father's death. The funds came from a discretionary account he'd set up for operational expenses, an account managed by Marco, his lieutenant, his most trusted advisor, the man whose voice had cracked with lies just 20 minutes ago. The betrayal had layers, conspiracies within conspiracies. His father had paid to keep him deaf. Marco had continued the arrangement after the old man died. And Dr. Morrison had spent 23 years lying to his face, hiding a treatable condition behind fabricated medical reports, all while collecting payments that would make most men wealthy. Liam's hands moved to his phone, hearing his own breathing accelerate with controlled rage. Each exhale carried the promise of consequences that would reshape his organization. He dialed Dr. Morrison's private number, the one reserved for family emergencies, and listened to it ring with a clarity that felt almost supernatural. When the doctor answered, Liam heard everything his voice tried to hide. The slight confusion at an unexpected call. The cultivated warmth of a trusted physician. And beneath it all, buried under decades of practiced deception, the microscopic tremor of a man who'd been living on borrowed time. "Dr. Morrison," Liam said, his voice steady despite the fury burning in his chest. "I need to see you immediately. My office. 6 o'clock tonight." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "And doctor? Bring your medical records. All of them. We have much to discuss about my condition." The medical building stood in the financial district, all polished chrome and tinted glass, a monument to expensive health care and exclusive treatment. Liam had been here dozens of times over the years, always leaving with the same verdict: permanent, incurable, accept your limitations. Tonight felt different as he walked through those familiar doors with Marco trailing 3 steps behind, silent and tense. The elevator hummed as it ascended to the 15th floor, and Liam catalogued every sound with predatory focus. The mechanical whir of cables pulling them upward. The soft ping at each passing level. Marco's breathing beside him, too controlled, too measured, the rhythm of someone working hard to appear calm. Liam said nothing, letting his lieutenants stew in uncertainty about why they were here, why the sudden change in routine. The reception area was empty except for Dr. Morrison's personal assistant, Claire, seated behind her modern desk. She looked up as they entered, and Liam heard what he'd never been able to before: the sharp intake of breath, the slight catch in her throat, the way her greeting came out just a fraction too high-pitched to be genuine calm. "Mr. Parker, Dr. Morrison is expecting you." Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the private office, and that trembling had a sound: the rustle of fabric, the soft tap of her rings against the desk surface as she tried to steady herself. Fear had a symphony all its own, and Liam was finally hearing every instrument. The doctor's office was exactly as he remembered: leather furniture, diplomas covering one wall, the examination chair positioned near the window. Dr. Morrison stood as they entered, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate. But Liam heard the floor creak under the doctor's weight as he shifted nervously, heard the barely audible swallow as Morrison tried to maintain his professional composure. "Liam, please sit." The doctor's voice carried practiced authority, but underneath ran a current of tension that no amount of training could completely hide. "You mentioned your condition on the phone. Has something changed?" Liam settled into the leather examination chair, and the sound of it adjusting beneath him seemed obscenely loud in the quiet office. Marco positioned himself near the door, guard dog stance, hands loose at his sides, ready for whatever came next. "Something changed this afternoon," Liam said, watching Morrison's face while listening to his breathing pattern shift. "I can hear you now, Doctor. Every word. Every hesitation. Every lie." The doctor's professional mask slipped for just a moment, long enough for Liam to catch the slight hitch in his breath, the accelerated pulse visible at his neck, and now, finally, the tremor in his voice when he responded. That's wonderful news. Spontaneous recovery is rare but not unheard of in certain cases." "Don't." Liam's single word cut through the air like a blade. "A maid removed an earwax blockage from my ear. Simple impaction. The kind of thing any competent ENT would notice during a basic examination." He leaned forward, letting the silence stretch. "The kind of thing you've been looking at for 23 years. Dr. Morrison's breathing became audible now, quick, shallow gasps he couldn't quite control. His hands moved to his desk, gripping the edge for stability, and Liam heard the wood groan under that desperate pressure. "I want you to examine my ear now, Doctor. Tell me what you see. Or more accurately, tell me what you don't see anymore." Liam tilted his head, offering access to the ear that had been cleared just hours ago. "And then I want you to explain to me how dozens of examinations somehow missed something a housekeeper found in 30 seconds. Morrison approached with the otoscope, his hands shaking badly enough that the instrument rattled. Liam heard every mechanical click as the doctor assembled it, heard the electronic buzz as the light activated, heard the ragged quality of Morrison's breathing as he peered into the ear canal that should have been cleared decades ago. When the doctor stepped back, his face had gone pale beneath the office lighting. The otoscope clattered against the metal tray, too loud, too telling, as his professional composure finally shattered. "It's gone," Morrison whispered, and his voice carried the weight of a man whose carefully constructed lies had just collapsed around him. "The blockage is completely gone." Liam remained perfectly still in the examination chair, letting the silence grow heavy between them. He'd learned decades ago that silence was a weapon, that people filled empty space with confession when given enough rope to hang themselves. But now he had something more powerful than silence. He could hear Morrison's body betraying him in real time. "How long was it there, Doctor?" Liam's voice came out soft, conversational, deadly. Morrison's throat worked, that swallowing sound impossibly loud in the quiet office. It's difficult to say with certainty. Impacted cerumen can develop over years, sometimes decades." "How long?" Each word precise, giving Morrison nowhere to hide. The doctor's breathing accelerated, becoming ragged at the edges. Liam heard him shift his weight, heard the subtle creak of expensive leather shoes under stress, heard the almost imperceptible tremor in his voice when he finally answered. "Since you were 14. The admission came out barely above a whisper. "It was visible during your first examination." Liam's hands tightened on the armrests, the leather groaning under his grip. 23 years. You saw it for 23 years and said nothing. It wasn't that simple." Morrison's voice cracked, pitching higher with desperation. Liam heard the lie forming before the words fully emerged, heard the way the doctor's breathing pattern changed when he tried to manufacture an excuse. "Don't lie to me again." Liam stood slowly, his movements deliberate, each footstep against the floor carrying menace. "I can hear you now, remember? Every hesitation. Every false note in your voice. Every time your breath catches because you're about to feed me another fabrication." Morrison backed against his desk, and Liam heard everything. The bump of his body against mahogany, the rustle of papers disturbed by his retreat, the quickening pace of his pulse audible in the sudden shallowness of his breathing. "Who paid you?" Liam stepped closer, closing the distance. "My father started it, I know that much. But he's been dead 5 years, and the payments continued. Who took over?" "I can't, I have patient confidentiality." "Patient confidentiality?" Liam's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. "You maintained a disability that wasn't real. You falsified medical records. You accepted payment to keep me deaf while I built an empire blind to half the information around me." He leaned in, close enough to hear Morrison's heart hammering against his ribs. "Who paid you?" Morrison's face crumbled, tears streaming down his cheeks. His voice, when it came, was broken, desperate, the sound of a man whose world was ending. "Your father wanted you controllable. He thought if you couldn't hear betrayal, you'd be easier to manipulate. Easier to..." He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy. "Easier to what?" Liam's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting ever could. "Easier to replace when the time came." Morrison's shoulders shook with sobs now, all pretense of professional dignity shattered. "He had another son. Older. From before your mother. Kept secret. Your deafness was supposed to make you vulnerable, make the transition of power smoother when he decided." The sound of Marco's sharp inhale cut through the confession. Liam's gaze snapped to his lieutenant, seeing the confirmation written across his face even before the man spoke. "Boss, I didn't know about any of this." But Marco's voice betrayed him, that slight elevation in pitch, that microscopic tremor that screamed guilt. "Yes, you did." Liam's words fell like guillotine blades. "I can hear it in every syllable. The question is whether you were complicit from the beginning or just opportunistic enough to continue it after my father died." Marco's hand drifted toward his jacket, and Liam heard the rustle of fabric over concealed steel. "Don't," Liam said quietly. "You won't clear the holster before I kill you." The room hung suspended in terrible silence, 3 men bound together by decades of lies finally exposed. And for the first time in his life, Liam Parker could hear the exact moment when loyalty died, replaced by the frantic calculations of men realizing they'd lost a game they didn't know they were playing. Liam returned to the mansion as night settled over the city, the harbor lights twinkling like false promises below his hill. The drive home had been silent. Marco was gone, handled with the kind of permanent efficiency that kept empires running smoothly. Dr. Morrison would spend the rest of his considerably shortened life understanding that some debts could never be repaid. The older brother his father had hidden would receive a visit that made Liam's position abundantly clear. But as he walked through his mansion's marble corridors, hearing his footsteps echo off walls that had witnessed decades of silent rule, Liam felt something shift inside him. The rage that had sustained him through the evening's revelations was giving way to something more complex, something that bordered on clarity. Bobby was still there, waiting in the staff sitting room where Mrs. Chen had presumably sequestered her hours ago. She stood as he entered, her orange uniform slightly rumpled now, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed a miracle and feared its consequences. She looked terrified, probably expecting dismissal or worse after the chaos her simple act of compassion had unleashed. "Mr. Parker, I'm so sorry if I overstepped," she began, her voice trembling. Liam raised a hand, silencing her, and heard the sharp intake of her breath as she braced for judgment. But instead of anger, he felt something unexpected wash over him. Gratitude. Not the transactional kind that came with business arrangements, but something deeper, more human than he'd allowed himself to feel in decades. "You gave me something today," he said quietly, listening to his own voice with continued wonder. "Something more valuable than you could possibly understand." Bobby's confusion was visible on her face, audible in the uncertainty of her breathing. "Everyone in my life has wanted something from me," Liam continued. "Power, protection, money, fear. They've lied, manipulated, hidden truths behind smiles and assurances." He gestured toward his ear, toward the miracle she'd performed. "But you just wanted to help. No agenda. No scheme. Just basic human compassion." He walked to the window, looking out at the empire he'd built through silence and observation, an empire he now understood had been compromised from its foundation. His father's conspiracy, Marco's continuation of it, decades of strategic disadvantage disguised as unchangeable fate. All of it designed to keep him controllable, vulnerable, easy to replace when convenient. But Bobby had changed everything. Not just by restoring his hearing, but by giving him the tool he needed most: truth. Raw, unfiltered, audible truth that couldn't hide behind carefully managed expressions. Now when his captains reported, he'd hear their deceptions. When his associates made promises, he'd catch the lies beneath their words. When his enemies planned betrayals, their voices would announce their intentions long before their actions did. "You handed me a weapon today," Liam said, turning back to face her. "The weapon of hearing truth. Of catching lies in real time. Of understanding what people really mean versus what they say." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "My father paid to keep me deaf because a deaf heir was easier to control. Marco continued it because a deaf boss was easier to manipulate. But you saw a man who needed help and you helped him." Bobby's tears started flowing then, relief mixing with overwhelming emotion. "I'm doubling your salary," Liam continued. "And you'll have a permanent position in this household, with protection that extends to your family. Because in a world where everyone has lied to me, you were the only one who told the truth, even when that truth was silence broken by compassion." He could hear her quiet sobs now, could hear the gratitude she couldn't quite articulate. And for the first time since that afternoon's revelation, Liam Parker smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face. The city below would learn soon enough that something had changed in the Parker Empire. That debts were being collected and betrayals answered. That the silent emperor had found his voice and was using it to purge every lie that had taken root during his decades of imposed deafness. But tonight, he simply stood in his mansion and listened to the sound of honest tears, the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.